The stagecoach kicked up a final, choking plume of dust and was gone, leaving Elara Vance standing alone at the edge of what called itself a town. The name on the faded sign, Redemption Creek, felt like a cruel joke whispered by a spiteful god. There was no redemption here, only dust. It was a fine, chalky powder, the color of bone, and it coated everything with a film of weary surrender. It settled on the brim of her hat, worked its way into the weave of her traveling dress, and formed a gritty paste on her tongue. The sun was a merciless white eye in a sky bleached of all color. It beat down on the raw, unpainted lumber of the half-dozen buildings that lined the single, rutted street. They were crude structures, hastily thrown up against the vast, indifferent emptiness of the Wyoming territory, and they offered no real comfort, no sense of permanence. They were temporary shelters in a land that had no intention of being tamed. Around her, the wilderness stretched to every horizon, a rolling sea of parched earth and thorny scrub under a sky that was too big, too silent. Elara felt as though she had been dropped onto another world. Her dress, once a respectable navy blue suitable for travel, was now tattered at the hem and grimed with the filth of a journey that had taken her from the green, orderly hills of Pennsylvania to this god-forsaken outpost, by train, by wagon, and finally by that rattling stagecoach. She had been carried further and further from everything she had ever known. Her fine, delicate features, the softness of her hands, the very way she held herself spoke of a gentility that had no currency here. She was a porcelain doll set down in a brickyard, and she could feel herself beginning to crack. In one hand, she clutched the handle of her small, worn valise, which held the entirety of her worldly possessions. In the other, she held a letter. The paper softened and creased from countless readings. The ink had faded, but the words were burned into her memory. They were the words of Mr. Alistair Finch, a man she had never met, a man whose photograph had shown a kind, if plain, face. His correspondence had been proper, his penmanship neat. He had written of his homestead, of the future they would build, of the security and purpose he could offer a woman left destitute by her father's death. His letters had been her only light in a dark and suffocating time, a promise of a new beginning. Now, standing in the oppressive heat of Redemption Creek, that promise felt as thin and fragile as the paper it was written on. She took a deep breath, the dusty air searing her lungs, and forced her feet to move. Her destination was the general store, the largest and most solid-looking building in the settlement. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door, a small bell jangled, announcing her arrival. The air inside was thick with the mingled scents of coffee, cured meat, leather, and unwashed bodies. A handful of men stopped their conversations and turned to stare. A woman sorting dried beans at a barrel looked up, her eyes narrowing with instant suspicion. Elara's gaze fell upon the proprietor, a portly man with a stained apron stretched tight across his belly. He was leaning on the counter, and his small, shrewd eyes gave her a long, appraising look that traveled from the dusty hem of her dress to the pale, strained oval of her face. It was not a welcoming look. It was the look of a man assessing livestock, calculating value and potential problems. "I am looking for Mr. Alistair Finch," Elara said, her voice sounding small and foreign in the stuffy silence. "I was told his homestead is near here." The proprietor grunted, a low sound in his throat. He wiped his hands on his apron, leaving greasy streaks. "Finch," he repeated, as if the name were a piece of gristle he was trying to work from his teeth. He picked up a scrap of brown paper and a nub of charcoal from the counter. Without another word, he sketched a crude map, his thick fingers clumsy. He pushed it toward her. "Out that way," he grunted, gesturing vaguely with his chin. "Couple miles. Can't miss it." Elara felt the weight of every eye in the room as she took the paper. She could hear the whispers starting up behind her, sharp and sibilant as snakes in dry grass. A woman alone, a mail-order bride. Most likely. She was a curiosity, a piece of property that had arrived without an owner to claim it. The speculation was a palpable thing, a greasy film that clung to her skin. She murmured a thank you that no one acknowledged and turned, fleeing the store and its suffocating judgment. Outside, the sun was even more relentless. She followed the crude map, which was little more than a line indicating the main track leading out of town and an X to mark the homestead. The walk was an ordeal. The road quickly dissolved into a faint trail winding through the brutal landscape. The soil was rocky, and thorny scrub bushes tore at her skirts. The wind began to pick up, a low, constant moan that seemed to be the only voice the land possessed. It whispered of loneliness, of hardship, of how small and insignificant she was in this vast, empty place. After what felt like an eternity, she saw it. Her heart, which had been a tight, anxious knot in her chest, sank like a stone. The homestead was a derelict, half-finished cabin that slumped to one side as if exhausted. The roof had partially collapsed, leaving a gaping hole open to the unforgiving sky. The windows were empty sockets. The yard was a tangle of weeds and overgrown scrub. And there, driven into the hard-packed earth a few feet from the front door, was a single, unadorned wooden cross. Hope, the foolish, desperate thing she had carried all the way from Pennsylvania, crumbled into dust and blew away on the mournful wind. She stood frozen, the crude map fluttering from her numb fingers. A voice, rough as burlap, startled her. "You looking for something?" Ilara turned to see a woman approaching from a neighboring homestead, a slightly more complete but equally grim-looking cabin about a quarter of a mile away. The woman was gaunt and weary, her face a road map of hardship and her eyes filled with a tired, seen-it-all expression. She wiped her hands on a faded apron, her movements cautious. I was looking for Mr. Alistair Finch," Ilara managed to say, her throat tight. "This is his claim, is it not?" The woman, Martha, stopped a few feet away, her gaze taking in Ilara's ruined dress and pale face. There was a flicker of something that might have been pity in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a weary impatience, as if Ilara's tragedy was just one more burden in a world already full of them. "It was," Martha said, her voice flat. "He's yonder." She nodded toward the simple cross. "Cholera. Took him over a month ago. Took him fast." The words did not seem real. They were just sounds, hanging in the air. Ilara stared at the cross, at the sad, neglected plot of land that was supposed to have been her future. A grave. Her new beginning was a grave. "He was a dreamer, that one," Martha continued, her voice devoid of sentiment. "Came out here with big ideas about farming this rock pile, had more ambition than sense. Left behind nothing but debts at the general store." She paused, her eyes lingering on Ilara's face. "You his kin?" "I was to be his wife," Ilara whispered, the words tasting like ash. Martha let out a short, harsh sigh that was not quite a laugh. "Well, girl, you're about a month too late for the wedding and a lifetime too early for the funeral. There's nothing for you here." With that, she turned and walked back toward her own cabin, a gaunt silhouette against the vast, empty landscape. Ilara did not know how long she stood there, staring at the raw wood of the cross. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the bleached sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. The world she had imagined, the life she had clung to, had vanished. She was utterly and completely alone, adrift in a hostile land with no money, no connections, and no way to go back. The walk back to Redemption Creek was a blur of despair. Her world had shrunk to the size of her own grief, a small, dark space with no windows and no doors. The town, when she reached it, looked even more forbidding in the gathering twilight. The yellow light spilling from the saloon windows seemed predatory, and the laughter from within sounded harsh and cruel. She could not bear the thought of facing those staring, judgmental eyes again. She found herself by the livery stable. The smell of horses, manure, and damp hay was thick in the air, driven by a primal need for shelter, for a place to hide from the world. She slipped into the cavernous, dark building. She found a ladder leading to the hayloft and climbed up, burying herself in the loose, sweet-smelling hay. It was a bed fit for an animal, a grim contrast to the neat, respectable life she had been promised. But it was a place to hide. As she lay there, listening to the sounds of the horses shifting below and the distant, raucous noise of the town, the first true, gnawing pangs of hunger began to sprout in the emptiness of her stomach. It was a new kind of fear, a deep, physical dread that overshadowed even her grief. The next few days were a slow, humiliating descent into destitution. Her meager funds, barely enough for a few pieces of hardtack, ran out on the second day. The hunger, once a dull ache, sharpened into a dizzying, all-consuming pain. She tried to find work, anything to earn the price of a meal. She approached the women of the town, offering her skills in mending and cleaning, but they looked at her fine, though now tattered, clothes and her soft hands with suspicion and contempt. They saw her as a rival for their husbands' attentions, or, worse, a fallen woman with no place in a respectable community. They turned her away with cold words and colder stares. The men were different. They saw her as an opportunity. A ranch hand offered her a hot meal in exchange for a visit to his bunkhouse after dark. The blacksmith suggested she could keep him company in the evenings. Their advances were crude, their intentions transparent. Each time, Ilara refused, her voice polite but her spine stiff with a pride she could not afford but could not abandon. Each refusal hardened their hearts against her. The word spread. The new woman was proud, stuck up. She thought she was too good for them. The town's preacher, Reverend Gideon, a stern man with a face like a clenched fist, offered her his own version of charity. He found her huddled near the church, trying to escape the wind. He offered her a room in the church belfry and a plate of food from his own table. The offer came with a condition. She would have to attend every service and publicly repent for the presumed vanity and foolishness that had led her to her current state. He judged her for her refined appearance, for her status as a mail-order bride who had failed to secure her man. His offer was not salvation. It was a prison sentence, a public shaming. The thought of it was more than her fragile pride could bear. She thanked him and refused, choosing the gnawing emptiness of her stomach over the soul-crushing weight of his charity. During these days of decline, as she drifted through the town like a ghost, she became aware of a man who seemed to exist on its periphery, much like herself. His name, she learned from a snippet of overheard conversation, was Silas. He was a cowboy, but he did not carouse in the saloon with the others. He was tall and lean, with the quiet, efficient competence of a man who was at home in the wilderness. He moved with a fluid grace that was wasted on the dusty street of Redemption Creek. What truly set him apart, however, was something in his features. There was a subtle cast to his high cheekbones, a darkness to his eyes that was different from the sun-weathered faces of the other men. He was of mixed heritage, a man who belonged to two worlds and was accepted by neither. She saw how the townspeople treated him. They gave him a wide berth, their interactions clipped and purely transactional. When he entered the general store, conversations would falter. She overheard one of the men mutter a low, ugly word in his direction, a word that branded him as something other, something less. Silas seemed to carry his isolation like a mantle. His gaze missed nothing but revealed little. On occasion, she would look up and find him watching her. It was not the predatory leer of the other men, not the suspicious glare of the women. It was a quiet, unreadable intensity, a stillness that was unnerving and yet, strangely, not threatening. He simply watched, his dark eyes taking in her slow, painful disintegration. Nearly a week had passed since her arrival. Starvation was no longer an abstract fear. It was a physical reality. It was a dizzying weakness that made the world swim before her eyes, a constant, twisting pain in her belly that blotted out all other thought. Her fine dress was now little more than rags, hanging loosely on her thinning frame. She had reached the end. There was only one thing left to her, one last asset she possessed. It was her hair. It was a thick, heavy cascade of chestnut brown that fell all the way to her waist. It had been her mother's pride, her one true vanity. The thought of losing it was like contemplating an amputation, but the thought of another night with the gnawing pain in her stomach was worse. With the last of her strength, she walked down the street toward the combined barbershop and saloon. It was a place no respectable woman would ever enter alone, a den of men and whiskey and vice. She pushed open the swinging doors and stepped inside. The room fell instantly silent. The tinny piano stopped mid-tune. Men paused with glasses halfway to their lips, their card games forgotten. They all turned to stare at the spectral figure in the doorway. Ilara's eyes fixed on the barber, a slick-haired man with a greedy glint in his eyes, who was standing by his chair. She walked toward him, each step an effort of will. The floorboards seemed to sway beneath her feet. Her voice, when she finally found it, was a reedy, desperate whisper. "Sir," she began, her throat raw, "I wish to sell my hair." The barber's eyebrows shot up. A low chuckle rumbled through the room. "I will sell it all," she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength from sheer desperation. "For the price of a meal and a stagecoach ticket, to anywhere." The men watched, their expressions a sickening mixture of pity, cruel amusement, and a low, simmering lust. They were watching a woman at the absolute end of her rope, and it was a fine spectacle. The barber stroked his chin, his eyes gleaming. He ran his gaze over the thick, healthy fall of her hair, already imagining the price he could get for it from a wig maker in Cheyenne or Denver. It was a fine piece of merchandise. "All right, girl," he said, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Sit yourself down." He gestured to the barber chair. Ilara closed her eyes for a moment, steeling herself. This was it, the final severing from the person she used to be. She walked to the chair and sat, her back rigid. She heard the metallic snick of his shears as he picked them up. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the cold steel on her neck, for the wrenching loss. A calm, low voice cut through the charged silence of the saloon. "Don't." The word was not loud, but it carried an authority that made every man in the room turn toward the doorway. Silas stood there, his tall frame filling the entrance. He had been watching, unseen. He stepped forward, his boots making a soft, deliberate sound on the dusty floorboards. He ignored the barber, ignored the staring men. His dark, intense eyes were fixed only on Ilara. He walked to the chair and looked down, first at the magnificent cascade of her hair, then into her haunted, desperate eyes. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Ilara mistook his intervention. She thought he meant to haggle, to offer a better price for her last vestige of dignity. With the last of her strength, she looked up at this near stranger, this fellow outcast, and whispered a heart-wrenching plea. "Take my hair instead," she breathed, a complete and final surrender. Silas moved closer, leaning down so that his voice was a low rumble only she could hear, a promise in the squalid, whiskey-soaked air. The words would change her life. "Keep it," he whispered. "I'll feed you both." He reached into his pocket and placed a few coins on the barber's counter, a silent payment for the man's time. Before Ilara could process what was happening, before her weakened body could collapse, he took her gently by the arm. He raised her from the chair and, without a backward glance, led her out of the saloon, away from the stunned, scornful eyes of the town, and into the coming night. The walk was a silent, shuffling journey away from the harsh lights of the saloon and into the deep, enveloping darkness of the prairie night. Ilara was a dead weight against Silas's side, her body too weak to do more than follow his lead. His grip on her arm was not tight or proprietary. It was simply there, a firm, steady anchor in a world that had dissolved into a dizzying blur of exhaustion and disbelief. She was too overwhelmed to speak, her mind a maelstrom of shame, confusion, and a strange, burgeoning gratitude that was too fragile to be put into words. And Silas, she was beginning to understand, was a man who had no need for them. His silence was a language all its own, a solid, encompassing presence that asked for nothing. They moved away from the center of Redemption Creek, past the last of the respectable, lamplit homesteads where families were settling in for the night, their lives neat and contained. They walked beyond the edge of the town's small sphere of influence, where the wilderness began to reclaim its own. The path grew fainter, the air cooler and cleaner, carrying the scent of dust and sage and the clean, mineral smell of water. Soon, Ilara could hear the gentle murmur of a creek and the rustle of leaves in a stand of cottonwood trees, their silvered bark ghostly in the moonlight. Nestled in the grove was a small, isolated cabin. It was nothing like the derelict shack Alistair Finch had left to rot. This place was modest, certainly, but it was meticulously maintained. The logs were chinked tight against the wind, the stone chimney was solid and well built, and a single, sturdy horse shifted in a small, neat corral. Beside the cabin, a woodpile was stacked with a precision that spoke of foresight and discipline, and a patch of land had been cleared and tilled, ready for a garden. This was not the home of a dreamer chasing fantasies. This was the home of a survivor, a place built not on hope, but on the stark, practical realities of existence in a hard land. It was a fortress of one. Inside, the cabin was as sparse and clean as the outside suggested. A single room held everything a person needed to live, and nothing more. A stone hearth, swept clean of old ash, dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and two simple chairs stood in the center of the room. In one corner was a narrow cot with a neatly folded blanket, and in the other, shelves holding basic supplies, tins of coffee, sacks of flour and salt, and neatly bundled dried herbs. Silas guided Ilara to one of the chairs by the cold hearth, his touch gentle as he helped her sit. She sagged into it, her bones aching with a weariness that felt ancient. He did not fuss over her or ask the questions that were surely swirling in the air between them. His movements were efficient, practical, and imbued with a quiet purpose. He knelt at the hearth and, with practiced ease, laid a fire, the kindling catching with a soft whoosh that brought the first flicker of warmth and life to the dark room. He took a bucket and disappeared outside, returning moments later with water from the creek, its coldness sharp in the air. He hung a small pot over the growing flames and added a handful of dried meat and some herbs from a pouch on the shelf. He did all this without a word, his focus complete. The act was purely functional, a response to a basic human need. Yet for Ilara, it was the most profound kindness she had ever known. It was a kindness without condition, without judgment. He was not saving her soul or expecting payment in kind. He was simply feeding a hungry creature he had found by the side of the road. When the broth was ready, he ladled it into a tin cup and brought it to her. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. He said nothing, simply knelt before her and held the cup to her lips, tilting it gently. The warm, salty liquid was a shock to her system. It was a taste of life itself, and her body, starved for so long, trembled with the shock of receiving it. As she sipped, she studied the man before her. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows across his face, highlighting the strong lines of his jaw and the quiet intensity in his dark eyes. His silence was not cold or empty. It was watchful, deep, a stillness that came from a lifetime of observation. She was beginning to understand that Silas was a man who communicated through actions, whose promises were made not with words, but with a stack of firewood, a clean floor, and a cup of hot broth offered to a stranger. That first night, he made it clear, through his behavior, that his offer was exactly as he had stated it, food and shelter. He gestured to the cot, its blanket a silent invitation. When Ilara hesitated, he simply took another blanket from a wooden chest and spread it on the floor for himself, a bedroll by the fire. He was establishing a boundary, a respectful distance that put her instantly at ease. He was offering her a sanctuary, not a cage, for the first time in a week. Ilara slept, a deep, exhausted sleep, cocooned in the warmth of the fire and the unexpected safety of a stranger's home. The initial days of their cohabitation were defined by this quiet, functional dynamic. A rhythm was established, dictated by the sun and the seasons. Silas would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. He would leave with his rifle and his traps, disappearing into the vast wilderness that was his true home. Ilara would wake to the sight of his empty bedroll and a small stack of firewood he had left for her by the hearth. He would return at dusk, sometimes with a rabbit or a brace of birds, which he would clean and prepare with a methodical skill that fascinated her. He was teaching her, through his silent example, the fundamental rhythms of survival on the frontier. Ilara, in turn, began to recover her strength. The constant, gnawing hunger subsided, replaced by a slow, returning energy. At first, she was a passive observer, watching him with a sense of awe and a deep, humbling gratitude. But soon, her ingrained sense of propriety, the part of her that had been raised to be useful, began to stir. A budding desire to contribute, to be more than a burden, compelled her to act. She started with small things. While he was away during the day, she would tidy the already clean cabin, sweeping the floor and wiping down the simple table. She found a small sewing kit in his chest and set about mending his worn shirts. The fabric was rough under her fingers, but the work was familiar, comforting. She took a kind of pride in the neat, tiny stitches, a skill from her old life that she could put to use in this new one. When Silas returned that evening and saw his mended shirt folded on his bedroll, he did not say anything, but she saw the brief, surprised flicker in his eyes, a small acknowledgement that was more meaningful than a torrent of words. She learned to tend the fire, to keep it burning low and steady throughout the day, ensuring the cabin was warm when he returned, chilled from the hunt. These small acts became her part of their silent contract, her way of earning her keep. As the days turned into a week, their shared silence began to soften at the edges, making way for a slow, tentative trust. Words began to fill the quiet spaces, not about their deep traumas or uncertain futures, but about small, everyday things. One afternoon, as she was gathering firewood near the creek, he came and stood beside her, pointing to a plant with broad, green leaves. "Yarrow," he said, his voice a low rumble, "good for fevers, and for stopping bleeding." He showed her how to recognize it, how to distinguish it from other, similar weeds. He pointed out wild onions and the beginnings of chokecherries on the bushes. He was sharing his knowledge, the hard-won wisdom of the wilderness, and in doing so, he was giving her a small piece of his world. She, in turn, offered him a piece of hers. The one book she had managed to keep, tucked away in her valise, was a small, worn volume of poetry. One evening, after their simple meal, when the firelight was casting long shadows on the walls, she took it out. Would you mind if I read aloud?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He looked up from the knife he was sharpening, his expression unreadable. He simply nodded. She began to read, her voice soft at first, then growing stronger as she lost herself in the familiar cadence of the verses. It was a world of gardens and drawing rooms, of sculpted emotions and intricate rhymes, a world as alien to this place as the moon. She expected him to be bored, to dismiss it as foolishness, but he was not. He put down his knife and listened with a profound, still attentiveness. He listened as if he were starved for a different kind of nourishment, for a beauty and order that the wilderness, for all its majesty, did not possess. It was during these quiet evenings that they began to learn the outlines of each other's pasts. The poetry seemed to unlock something in them, a willingness to share the stories that had shaped them. Ilara spoke of her father, a merchant who had lost everything in a bad investment, and of his subsequent death, which had left her and her mother at the mercy of relatives. She spoke of the suffocating politeness of her life as a poor relation, a life of mending other people's clothes and swallowing other people's insults, a life where her only value was in securing a suitable marriage. The offer from Mr. Finch, she explained, had not been a romantic dream. It had been an escape route, a desperate bid for a life that was her own. Silas's story came out in fragments, pieces of a puzzle he had spent his life trying to solve. He spoke of his mother, a Cheyenne woman who had taught him the names of the stars and the language of the birds. She had died of a fever when he was just a boy. His father was a white trapper, a restless man who was a stranger in both the white world and the native one. He had taught Silas how to track, to hunt, to survive in the wilderness. And then, one day, he had simply disappeared, walking into the mountains and never coming back. Silas spoke of the prejudice he had faced his entire life, of being too white for his mother's people and too native for his father's. He spoke of the impossibility of ever truly belonging anywhere, of the isolation that had been his only constant companion. In sharing their stories, they discovered they were not so different. Both were outcasts, adrift in a world that had no place for them. Their bond was forged in this shared understanding, a quiet recognition of the wounds the world had left on them. But their fragile peace could not last. The world outside the cottonwood grove had not forgotten them, and its malice began to filter into their sanctuary. The gossip from Redemption Creek, carried on the wind, was ugly. Elara Vance, the pitiable, abandoned bride, was now a fallen woman, a harlot who had shacked up with the half-breed in the woods. Their cohabitation was a scandal, an affront to the town's rigid, unforgiving morality. Silas felt the change whenever he had to go into town for supplies he could not make or hunt himself: flour, salt, coffee. The proprietor of the general store, who had always been curt, was now openly hostile. The prices were suddenly higher for Silas, a special tax levied on his existence. Men who had once ignored him now tried to provoke him in the street, bumping into him or making loud, pointed remarks about the company he was keeping. He absorbed it all with his usual stoicism, his face a mask of stone, but Elara could see the tension in his shoulders when he returned, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. She experienced the town's hostility firsthand one afternoon when she accompanied him, needing thread for her mending. As they walked down the main street, a silence fell. Conversations stopped, doors were closed. It was as if they were lepers. The women of the town, led by the preacher's wife, Mrs. Gideon, were gathered outside the church. As Elara and Silas approached, Mrs. Gideon turned her back in a deliberate, theatrical gesture of shunning. The other women followed suit, whispering loudly to one another about her lack of shame, her wickedness. The encounter left Elara feeling as though she had been physically struck. The humiliation was a hot, burning thing in her cheeks, but beneath the shame, a new and unfamiliar emotion began to smolder. Anger, a fierce, protective anger. For the first time, she truly understood the isolation Silas lived with every single day. They were branding her with the same iron they had used on him. In that moment, she felt a profound sense of solidarity with him. They were outcasts together. It was an event born not of human cruelty, but of the wilderness itself that finally solidified their partnership. A mountain lion, lean and hungry after the lean months, began to stalk the area. At first, it was just a set of tracks Silas found by the creek, the prints large and unnervingly close to the cabin. The threat was real, a palpable presence that haunted the edges of their clearing. One evening, as twilight bled into night, the beast grew bold. Elara was inside, cleaning up after their meal, when Silas's horse let out a terrified, high-pitched scream from the corral. She looked out the small window and saw a sleek, powerful shadow moving near the fence. The mountain lion. Her blood ran cold, and she was frozen with a primal, paralyzing fear. Silas was outside in an instant, his rifle in his hands. He did not hesitate. He moved with a calm, focused intensity, a man meeting a familiar foe. The encounter was a tense, silent dance in the moonlight, a contest of wills between the predator and the man. He did not fire immediately. He made himself large, shouting at the animal, a challenge in a language it understood. The lion, crouched and ready to spring, met his gaze, its tail twitching. Finally, as it gathered itself to leap the fence, Silas fired. The shot was not aimed to kill. It was aimed at the ground just in front of the beast, a deafening explosion of sound and fury that sent dirt and rock flying. The lion, startled and unnerved, abandoned its attack and melted back into the shadows of the wilderness. Silas stood there for a long moment, his rifle still raised, watching the darkness where the creature had disappeared. When he finally came back inside, the cabin was filled with the sharp smell of gunpowder. He was shaken. She could see that now. His hands were not quite steady as he set the rifle down, and there was a faint sheen of sweat on his brow. For all his competence, for all his deep understanding of the wild, he was not immune to fear. For the first time, Ilara saw the vulnerability beneath his stoic exterior. She noticed a long, bleeding scratch on his forearm, a souvenir from a stray branch in his haste to confront the lion. Without thinking, she went to the shelf, took a clean rag, and dipped it in the water bucket. She came to him and gently took his arm. He stiffened for a moment at her touch, surprised, then relaxed. She carefully cleaned the wound, her touch gentle, her focus complete. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted, subtly but irrevocably. She was no longer just the helpless woman he had rescued, the protected creature in his care. He was not just her stoic, unbreachable protector. They were partners. She realized, with a sudden, startling clarity, that she was not a burden he had taken on. Her presence here, her small acts of mending his shirts and tending his fire and cleaning this small wound, they mattered to him. They had made his solitary cabin a home. The tragedy of their shared isolation was beginning to give way to the fragile, tentative hope of their shared existence. The fierce heat of summer bled away, replaced by the golden hues of a Wyoming autumn. The sun, no longer a tyrant, cast long, benevolent shadows across the land, and the air grew crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of distant snow. The practical arrangement between Ilara and Silas, born of desperation and charity, deepened with the changing season into a rich, unspoken intimacy. The rhythms of their daily life, once separate and tentative, were now intertwined, a quiet dance of shared purpose. Their world was a singular focus, the coming winter. Silas spoke of it not with fear, but with a grave and profound respect that sent a chill down Ilara's spine. It was a living entity, a white wolf that would stalk their small cabin for months, and their survival depended entirely on their preparation. They worked from sunup to sundown, a silent, efficient team. He taught her the ways of his world, the knowledge passed down from his father and his mother's people. He showed her how to scale and clean the fish he caught in the creek, their silver bodies slick in her hands, and how to smoke them over a slow fire of cottonwood chips until the flesh was pink and firm. He brought back a deer from the high country and taught her how to jerk the venison, slicing it into thin strips and drying it on racks in the sun until it was tough and dark, a promise of protein for the lean months ahead. Together, they insulated the cabin's walls, mixing mud from the creek bank with dried grass to chink the spaces between the logs, their hands working side by side in the cold, wet mixture. He taught her to read the signs in nature that foretold the weather, the way the smoke from their chimney behaved, the pattern of clouds on the horizon, the frantic activity of the squirrels in the cottonwoods. It was a language she had never known existed, and she was a diligent, if sometimes clumsy, student. She, in turn, brought a softness and order to his solitary life. The inside of the cabin, once merely a shelter, became a home. She had made a brave trip to see Martha, the gaunt woman from the neighboring homestead, and had traded a week's worth of mending for a handful of seeds. In the tilled patch of earth beside the cabin, she planted a small winter garden of hardy roots, turnips and carrots, their green tops a defiant splash of life against the encroaching harshness of the season. The small garden was her own quiet declaration. She was not a temporary guest. She was putting down roots. The romantic tension between them grew not in grand gestures or impassioned speeches, but in the quiet, charged moments that punctuated their days. It was in the way he would pause in his work to watch her hands, dusted with flour as she kneaded dough for their daily bread. His gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. It was in the way her breath would catch in her throat when he stood behind her to guide her hand, showing her the proper way to hold a skinning knife. His body a warm, solid presence at her back, his voice a low murmur by her ear. These moments were fleeting, but they left an imprint on the air, a longing that was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. One evening, after their meal, Ilara sat on a low stool by the fire, brushing her long hair. The firelight turned the chestnut strands to molten bronze. It was a nightly ritual, a connection to the woman she had been, a small act of self-possession. She was lost in the repetitive motion, the pull of the brush through the thick waves. When she sensed him behind her, he had moved with his usual silence. She froze, the brush still in her hand. Quietly, he came up behind her and took the brush from her unresisting fingers. His own hands were calloused and scarred from a life of hard work, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he continued the motion, drawing the brush from the crown of her head all the way to her waist. Each stroke was slow, deliberate, a question and a statement all in one. A tremor ran through her, a current of heat that had nothing to do with the fire. They did not speak. They did not need to. The air in the small cabin was thick with everything they had left unsaid, with a desire born not of simple lust, but of profound recognition. In the quiet solitude of their shared exile, they saw each other, truly saw each other, in a way no one else ever had. This burgeoning love story was a fragile flower blooming in the shadow of a storm, and the storm was Redemption Creek. Their self-sufficient isolation, their quiet partnership, was seen as an affront to the town's social and religious order. The whispers that had followed them now hardened into open hostility, and the source of that hostility began to emerge more clearly. His name was Jacob Bartlett. Bartlett was a wealthy rancher, a man whose land and cattle stretched for miles. He owned the largest homestead, held the note on the general store, and paid a portion of the preacher's salary. He was, in all but name, the king of Redemption Creek, and he saw the world in terms of ownership and control. He was a man accustomed to taking what he wanted. From the moment Ilara had stepped off that stagecoach, a pretty, refined creature so out of place in his dusty kingdom, he had wanted her. He had seen her as a docile object to be acquired, a fine new mare for his stable. Her choosing to live with Silas, a man Bartlett considered to be of an inferior stock, was not just a puzzle to him, it was a personal insult to his power, a flagrant violation of the racial and social hierarchy he enforced with an iron fist. He began a campaign of targeted harassment, using the townspeople as his willing tools. One morning, Silas went to the creek for water and found the stream that ran by their cabin fouled, the water murky and stinking. Upstream, they found the bloated carcass of a dead calf, deliberately thrown into their water source. The act was both petty and dangerous. It forced Silas to spend a week of back-breaking labor digging a new well closer to the cabin, his body aching with the effort while Ilara watched, her heart a cold knot of fury and fear. The traps Silas set for game, their lifeline for the winter, were sprung and stolen. He would return from his trap lines empty-handed day after day, his jaw tight with a frustration he refused to voice. One night, as they sat by the fire, the sound of a galloping horse thundered past their cabin, followed by the deafening crack of a rifle shot fired into the air. The bullet whizzed through the cottonwood trees, a clear message of intimidation. Ilara had jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs, but Silas had simply moved to the window, his face a mask of cold, controlled rage, watching the rider disappear into the darkness. It was one of Bartlett's ranch hands. There was no doubt. Reverend Gideon, his piety bought and paid for by Bartlett's patronage, did his part from the pulpit. His Sunday sermons, once dreary recitations on sin, now took on a new, fevered intensity. He preached fire and brimstone condemnations of those who lived in defiance of God's order, of unholy unions that mocked the sanctity of the community. He never used their names, but every soul in that small church knew who he was talking about. He was whipping the town into a state of righteous fear, painting Silas and Ilara as a moral contamination that threatened them all. A tragic turning point came with the first deep chill of late autumn. Martha, the lonely neighbor who had shown Ilara that first sliver of kindness, fell ill with a lung fever. Word reached them through a passing trapper. Ilara, feeling a profound sense of duty to the only other woman who had not treated her with contempt, insisted on going to help nurse her. Silas warned against it. The town's mood was ugly, he told her, and her presence would only stir up more trouble. But Alara's spirit, once so fragile, had been tempered by hardship. She would not hide in fear while another person suffered. After a tense, quiet argument, Silas relented, his eyes dark with a worry he could not hide. At Martha's small, stuffy cabin, Alara found the woman weak and delirious, her breath a shallow, rattling gasp. She spent 2 days there, tending the fire, forcing broth between Martha's cracked lips, and placing cool, damp cloths on her fevered brow. On the afternoon of the second day, a wagon pulled up outside. It was Jacob Bartlett, accompanied by Reverend Gideon. They had come, they announced, to pay a charitable visit to the sick. The preacher hovered nervously by Martha's bedside, murmuring prayers, but Bartlett's attention was entirely on Alara. He cornered her near the hearth, his large frame blocking her escape. He smelled of whiskey and expensive soap. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice a low, confidential purr that made her skin crawl. "It is a tragedy to see a woman of your quality reduced to such circumstances." His eyes flickered around the squalid cabin, then settled back on her with a look of smug pity. "I have been concerned for your welfare," he continued. "For your soul, this life you are living. It is not right. It is not fit for a decent woman." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "I am prepared to offer you a way out, a position in my own home. As my personal housekeeper, you would have a warm room, good food, respectable work. You would be safe, protected." The offer was an ultimatum, delivered with the smug certainty of a man who believed every person had a price. He was framing it as an act of Christian charity, a chance to save her from her sinful life. But his eyes, small and hard, revealed a possessive, predatory intent. He was not offering her a job. He was offering her a gilded cage. "All you would have to do," he finished, his smile tightening, "is leave that man and renounce your wicked ways. Publicly, of course. In the church, the Reverend will help you with your confession." He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. "If you refuse," he added, his voice losing its purr and taking on a hard, menacing edge, "then I can no longer be held responsible for what happens. The good people of this town have a strong sense of justice. I will no longer be able to protect you, or him, from their justifiable anger." Alara was shaken to her core. The offer was a phantom from her past, a temptation she had not realized still had power. It was the life of security she had once craved, a return to a world of clean sheets and regular meals, a world she understood. But the thought of accepting it, the thought of leaving Silas, of standing in that church and betraying the quiet dignity and profound connection they had built, was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting knife in her gut. She looked at Jacob Bartlett, at his self-satisfied face, and she saw him for what he was, a tyrant who wanted to own her, a bully who broke everything he could not control. In a moment of defining strength, she straightened her shoulders and looked him directly in the eye. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was as clear and cold as creek water running over stone. "Thank you for your offer, Mr. Bartlett," she said, "but I am not in need of saving." His face darkened, the mask of civility falling away to reveal a flash of raw fury. Her rejection was quiet, but it was absolute. It was not just a refusal of his offer. It was a declaration of her loyalty, her allegiance, her love. She returned to her own cabin that evening as the sun was setting, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a strange, exhilarating resolve. The air was cold, and the sky was the color of a fresh bruise. Silas was waiting for her, his silhouette framed in the warm light of the open doorway. He had been watching for her. She told him everything that had happened, her words tumbling out in the quiet intimacy of their home. He listened without interruption, his face a mask of stone, but she could see the tension in the set of his jaw, the way his hands, resting on the table, were clenched into tight fists. When she had finished, he was silent for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. "You should have taken it," he said finally, his voice low and rough. He would not look at her. "He would have kept you safe. I cannot." It was the first time she had ever seen him truly afraid. And he was not afraid for himself. He was afraid for her. The realization pierced her heart. This was the moment, the turning point. Ilara stepped forward, closing the distance between them. For the first time, she initiated a physical contact born not of need or comfort, but of pure, undiluted affection. She placed her hand flat on his chest, over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat beneath her palm. She looked up into his dark, tormented eyes. "This is my home now," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "I am not leaving." Her choice was made. She had cast her lot with him, not for survival, but for love. In that moment, they both understood. They were no longer two lonely individuals surviving together against the world. They were a family, a fortress of two, and they would face the coming storm as one. As she stood there, her hand on his heart, a movement outside the small window caught her eye. She turned her head and saw it. The first snowflake of the season, a single, perfect crystal, drifted down from the darkening sky. It was followed by another, and then another. It was beautiful, but it was an omen, a silent, ominous portent of the long, hard trial to come. The first snow, the gentle harbinger that had fallen like a blessing, was a liar. Within hours, it revealed its true nature. The wind, which had been a mere whisper, rose to a mournful howl, then escalated into a full-throated, ravenous scream. It was the sound of a starving animal, a beast of ice and air that clawed at the walls of their small cabin, searching for a way in. The snow no longer drifted. It fell in a blinding, suffocating sheet, a vertical river of white that erased the world. The cottonwood trees, the creek, the vast prairie beyond, all of it vanished, swallowed by a churning, featureless void. Silas, who had spent a lifetime learning to read the signs of a coming winter, was still caught off guard by the storm's sheer, untempered ferocity. He had prepared for hardship. But this was something else entirely. This was an assault. The world shrank to the four log walls of their home, a tiny, fragile island in a roaring, frozen sea. The blizzard became a third character in their story, a relentless and indifferent force whose only aim was to break them, to grind them down with its ceaseless noise and its suffocating, absolute power. The days blurred into a monotonous, gray twilight, the sun completely obliterated. Their lives were reduced to a primal, repetitive cycle, keeping the fire alive, rationing their precious food, and listening to the storm rage. The confinement was absolute, a pressure that was both physical and psychological. The world outside had ceased to exist, and the world inside grew smaller with each passing hour. Initially, they found a strange comfort in their shared isolation. The storm, in its attempt to tear them apart, only forced them closer together. They were rarely more than a few feet from one another, their movements a quiet choreography in the cramped space. There was a new level of intimacy in the simple act of sharing a blanket, of his hand brushing hers as he added a log to the fire. But as the days stretched into a week, the small cabin, once a refuge, began to feel like a cage. The silence between them, once comfortable and freighted with unspoken affection, now grew heavy with their unspoken fears. They were trapped, with a finite supply of firewood and a dwindling cache of food to see them through an unknowable amount of time. The weight of it began to change Silas. He grew more withdrawn, his silences deeper, tinged with a darkness Ilara had not seen before. The immense responsibility for her life rested on his shoulders like a physical burden. Bowing him, in his eyes, she saw a flicker of a terrible guilt. He had brought her here. He had offered her shelter, and in doing so, he had led her into this trap. He felt he had failed her, that his promise to feed her was turning to ash in his mouth. Ilara, in turn, saw his turmoil and fought against the tide of her own fear to become his source of strength. While he retreated into a bleak, stony silence, She filled the space with a quiet, determined normalcy. She spoke of small things, of memories from her childhood, of the poems in her book. She kept their small space as tidy as a drawing room, and she portioned out their meager meals with a sense of ceremony, as if they were dining at a fine table instead of hovering on the brink of starvation. She was fighting the despair that was seeping through the walls, using the simple weapons of routine and gentle words to keep it at bay. The dark tragedy of their ordeal began to unfold as the storm stretched from 1 week into 2. Their carefully preserved food stores dwindled at an alarming rate. The strips of jerked venison, which had seemed so plentiful, were now a pitifully small bundle. The smoked fish was gone. The cold became a physical entity, a predator that was no longer kept outside but had found its way in, seeping through the chinking in the walls and rising up from the floorboards. Their fire, once a roaring source of comfort, was now a carefully managed, hungry thing that demanded constant tribute. The woodpile Silas had so meticulously stacked was shrinking as quickly as their food. Soon, he was forced to make a terrible choice. He looked at the simple, rough-hewn stool he had made years ago, and then he looked at the dying fire. With a grin set to his jaw, he took his axe and broke it apart, feeding the pieces to the flames. A few days later, the small wooden chest that held their spare blankets followed. Each act was a small surrender, an admission that they were losing their battle. The true crisis hit when Alara fell ill. It began as a small, dry cough, a tickle in her throat, but in the cold, damp air of the cabin, it quickly took root in her lungs, deepening into a fever that left her weak and shivering, her skin alternately burning with heat and chilled to the bone. Soon, she was delirious, lost in a gray, hazy world of fragmented memories and fever dreams. Without access to a doctor or proper medicine, Silas had to rely on the fading ghosts of his mother's knowledge. He unearthed the small cache of herbs he had had the foresight to gather in the fall. He brewed a bitter tea from willow bark to fight the fever, and a concoction of yarrow and mint to soothe her rattling cough. Nursing Alara became his sole, all-consuming focus. The world beyond her sickbed ceased to exist. He did not sleep for more than a few minutes at a time, dozing in a chair by her cot, his senses tuned to every subtle change in her breathing. He was a constant, patient presence, constantly tending the fire, forcing sips of warm herb tea or thin, watery broth past her cracked lips. When her shivering became uncontrollable, a violent, bone-jarring tremor, he would lie down on the narrow cot beside her, gathering her into his arms, trying to pour his own body heat into her. He held her for hours, his heart aching with a terrifying sense of helplessness, feeling the fragile life in her flicker like a candle in the wind. During her delirium, the walls she had built around her past crumbled. She spoke in a broken, whispering voice of a life she had never shared with him. She spoke of her father, a cold and distant man who had valued his ledgers more than his daughter. She spoke of the suffocating, silent house of her childhood, a place of duty without warmth, of propriety without love. She murmured of her dreams. Simple, childish dreams of a life with color and meaning, a life where she was seen, where she was cherished. Silas listened to these broken confessions, each word a small stone added to the weight of sorrow in his own heart. He smoothed the damp hair from her forehead and felt his love for her deepen into something fierce and elemental. He saw her then, not as the fragile, genteel creature he had rescued from the saloon, but as a fighter, a survivor with a spirit as resilient and tenacious as any he had ever known. She had endured a lifetime of coldness and neglect, and still, she had carried a spark of hope all the way to this God-forsaken place. This period was a crucible for his emotions, stripping away the layers of his stoic reserve and laying bare the profound depth of his love for her. He found himself whispering to her while she slept, the words he could never say to her waking self spilling out into the quiet cabin. He told her stories his mother had told him, stories of the stars and the seasons, of the coyote who tricked the moon. He made her promises, his voice a low, desperate prayer in the darkness. He promised her that she would see the spring, that he would show her the first crocus pushing through the snow. He promised her a garden. He promised her everything, if only she would live. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, her fever broke. The fire within her receded, leaving her terribly weak, a pale, hollowed-out specter of her former self. But she was alive. The relief that washed over Silas was so immense it left him dizzy. But their ordeal was far from over. It had simply entered its final, most desperate stage. The last of their preserved meat was gone. They were down to a handful of flour and a few withered carrots from her garden, which he had dug out from under the snow. Starvation was no longer a distant threat. It was a present, gnawing reality. They were both gaunt, their bodies aching with the twin agonies of hunger and cold. In this moment of shared, ultimate desperation, huddled together on the cot under a meager pile of blankets, all pretense fell away. They were no longer a man and a woman, a protector and the protected. They were just two human souls, clinging to life and to each other in the vast, frozen emptiness. Looking at Silas's weary, guilt-ridden face in the faint light of the dying fire, Elara reached up a trembling hand and touched his cheek. His skin was cold, stretched tight over his sharp cheekbones. "Silas," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "I am not sorry. I am not sorry I stayed." She saw the question, the guilt, that still lived in his eyes. "These months with you, they have been the only time in my life I have ever felt truly free." Her words were a gift, an absolution that seemed to break something open inside him. He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, and she felt the dampness of a tear. He, in turn, finally confessed the feelings he had held locked away for so long, his voice cracking with an emotion he could no longer contain. "I have loved you, Elara," he said, the words raw and stripped of all romance, born from the imminent threat of death. "I think I have loved you since that first moment I saw you in the saloon. You were trying to trade that beautiful hair for a meal, and all I could see was your pride, your strength. I saw a world that was trying to beat you down, and you, standing there, refusing to be broken." It was in this state of ultimate vulnerability, with the howling of the wind as their only witness and the specter of death as their priest, that their love was consummated. It was not an act of passion, not a fire of lust in the cold. It was something far more profound. It was a desperate, elemental affirmation of life in the face of annihilation. It was a pledge, a final, intimate communion that said, "If we die, we will not die alone." His touch was gentle, reverent, as if he were memorizing the feel of her. Her response was a total, trusting surrender. It was a sharing of the last of their warmth, a single, flickering point of heat and connection in a vast, frozen wasteland. They fell asleep tangled in each other's arms, not knowing if they would ever wake up. The silence was the first thing that registered, a profound, ringing silence that was more shocking than the ceaseless din that had preceded it. The storm had broken. After weeks of raging, the wind had finally cried itself out. Elara opened her eyes. A single, thin sliver of pale, watery sunlight had managed to penetrate the grime on the window pane, falling in a dusty beam across her face. She was alive. A renewed, desperate will to live surged through Silas. He carefully untangled himself from Elara's sleeping form and pulled on his boots. Using the last of his strength, he forced the cabin door open against the deep drift of snow that had buried it. He stepped outside into a world reborn. The landscape was a pristine, white desert, impossibly beautiful and utterly lethal. The snow was piled in deep, sculpted drifts, and the air was so cold it burned his lungs. For hours, he fought his way through the deep snow, his body screaming with exhaustion and hunger. He made his way to where his trap lines were, praying to a god he wasn't sure he believed in. He dug through the snow with his bare, freezing hands, searching for the markers he had left. The first trap was empty. The second was sprung, a victim of the storm. Hope began to fail him. Then, at the third, his numb fingers found the chain. He pulled, and there, caught in the snow-covered trap, was a rabbit. It was small, but it was life. It was a miracle. He carried it back to the cabin like a holy relic. The simple meal they shared later was a feast, a sacrament. The taste of the meat was the most exquisite thing either of them had ever known. They had survived the blizzard. They were scarred, emaciated, and weakened to their very bones. But they were together. Their bond, forged in the darkest of crucibles, was now truly, absolutely, unbreakable. The brutal winter, having done its worst, finally broke its grip on the land. The snows, which had buried the world in a shroud of white, began a slow, grudging retreat, melting away to reveal a landscape washed clean, poised for renewal. From the crucible of their cabin, Ilara and Silas emerged, not as the same people who had entered it, but as two souls forged into one. They were thinner, their faces marked by the hardship, but their spirits were intertwined in a way that made them stronger than they had ever been apart. The world felt new, a miracle of soft earth and birdsong. They took a quiet, profound joy in the simple signs of spring's return. The first green buds on the cottonwood trees were a cause for celebration. The gurgle of the once frozen creek was the sweetest music they had ever heard. They worked together from dawn until dusk, their movements now in a comfortable, practiced sync. They repaired the sections of the cabin roof damaged by the weight of the snow and tilled the earth for a larger garden, their hands in the dirt, planting the seeds of their future. Their love, confessed in the depths of despair, now blossomed in the tentative sunlight. It lived in the small, unadorned moments of their life together. It was in the shared laughter that erupted over a simple meal of rabbit stew, a sound that felt sacred after the long, grim silence of the storm. It was in a stolen kiss while they worked in the garden, a moment of spontaneous affection that left them both breathless. It was in the quiet, absolute comfort of falling asleep in each other's arms each night, a silent affirmation that they were home, that they were safe. The ghosts of their pasts, the loneliness that had defined both their lives, seemed to finally recede, banished by the simple, powerful reality of their shared present. But their newfound peace was as fragile as the first spring blossoms. Beyond their sanctuary in the cottonwood grove, the town of Redemption Creek had not forgotten them. The malice, having festered under the snow throughout the long winter, resurfaced with the thaw, renewed and more vigorous than before. As travel became possible again, the story of their survival spread. And to one man, it was not a miracle but an intolerable offense. Jacob Bartlett, the rancher who ruled the town, was incensed. He had expected the winter to solve his problem, to erase the man he despised and the woman who had defied him. To see them emerge from the blizzard, alive and, by all appearances, content, was a direct challenge to his authority, a mockery of the natural order he sought to command. Their resilience, their quiet happiness, was a sin he could not abide. He became obsessed with the idea of breaking them, of reclaiming the social hierarchy they had so flagrantly violated, and of punishing the woman who had chosen an outcast over a king. The plot he devised was calculated and cruel, designed not merely to run them out of town, but to turn the entire community against Silas in a way that felt like righteous justice. An opportunity arose when a small but significant cache of gold dust was stolen from the town's assay office. The gold belonged to a mining company in which Bartlett himself was a major stakeholder. The theft sent a shockwave of fear and insecurity through the small community. Gold was the lifeblood of the territory, and its theft was an attack on everyone's fragile prosperity. Bartlett seized the moment. He strode into the saloon, the unofficial center of the town's public life, and immediately, publicly, cast suspicion on Silas. His argument was insidious and effective. Who else, he asked the assembled crowd, had the skills to move so quietly in the night? Who else knew the hidden trails and the dark places of the wilderness so well? He painted a picture of Silas as a shadowy figure, half savage and untrustworthy, a man who lived by his own laws. He used Silas's outcast status, his very difference, as evidence of his criminality. To cap it all, he fabricated a story telling the easily manipulated sheriff that he had seen Silas lurking near the back of the assay office just a few nights prior, his face hidden in the shadows. The town, already primed by Reverend Gideon's sermons and steeped in a deep-seated prejudice, was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Bartlett's accusation was that spark. It was easier to believe in the guilt of an outsider than to imagine the thief was one of their own. The murmur of suspicion quickly grew into a roar of conviction. A posse was formed within the hour. It was led by Bartlett, his face a mask of grim civic duty, and the town's sheriff, a weak-willed man named Peters, who was little more than Bartlett's puppet. They rode out toward Silas and Alara's cabin, a grim procession of righteous anger. The sound of a dozen approaching horses sent a jolt of alarm through Alara. She and Silas were outside, weeding the new garden, when the riders broke through the trees. The scene that followed was a blur of tension and violence. Alara stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture of peace, trying to reason with them, to ask what was wrong. "Sheriff Peters, what is the meaning of this?" she asked, her voice clear and steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Bartlett answered for him. "We are here on official business. A theft in town. We have a warrant to search this property." "A warrant? For what cause?" she demanded. One of Bartlett's ranch hands, a brutish man named Cobb, shoved her roughly aside. "Stay out of it, woman." Silas moved in an instant, placing himself between Alara and the men, his body a rigid wall of protective fury. "Don't touch her," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Now, Silas," Bartlett said with a smug smile. "No need for trouble. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear." The men, fueled by a self-righteous hatred, swarmed into the small cabin. They ransacked the home that Alara and Silas had so lovingly rebuilt. They overturned the table, threw their meager possessions onto the floor, and tore the blankets from their cot. It was not a search. It was a violation, an act of pure malice disguised as law. Alara watched in horror, her heart breaking as she saw their fragile peace being torn to shreds. Then came the moment the entire performance had been building towards. As planned, Cobb, who was searching near the hearth, let out a shout of discovery. "Sheriff, over here, look what I found." He reached under a loose floorboard, a spot Silas had been meaning to fix, and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. He opened the drawstring, and a stream of glittering gold dust poured into his palm. The evidence, so perfectly planted, was damning. Silas did not move. He did not shout or protest his innocence. He simply stood there, his eyes, filled with a cold, clear rage, locked on Jacob Bartlett. He knew, in that instant, exactly how he had been trapped. He did not resist as Sheriff Peters, with a show of reluctant duty, bound his hands behind his back. To fight would be to prove their accusations, to seal his own fate. His only defiance was in that unbroken, accusing stare. He was brutally arrested, shoved and prodded towards a horse. As they dragged him away, the entire town seemed to turn out to watch the spectacle. Men, women, and even children lined the dusty street, jeering and shouting insults, their faces twisted with a mixture of fear and ugly triumph. Alara was left alone, standing amidst the wreckage of their home. The life they had just begun to build shattered in a single, violent instant. The despair she felt was a cold, familiar ache, a ghost from her first days in this terrible town. But this time, it was different. This time, the despair was mingled with a burning, unfamiliar fury that was so hot it felt like it might consume her. In that moment, standing in the ruins of her happiness, Alara Vance was transformed. She was no longer the helpless, frightened woman who had arrived in Redemption Creek, ready to trade her last piece of identity for a meal. The gaunt, starving creature who had stumbled into the saloon was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had survived a blizzard, who had stared death in the face and had not flinched. The survival skills Silas had taught her, and the strength she had discovered deep within herself during their darkest hours, now became her weapons. She refused to succumb to despair. She spent an hour methodically, carefully, putting their home back in order. Each act of setting things right was an act of defiance. Her love for Silas, a love forged in hardship and sealed in intimacy, now fueled a fierce, cold determination to prove his innocence. She knew with an absolute, unwavering certainty that he was being framed. She had seen the truth in the chilling silence of his eyes as they had led him away. Her fight for justice was a lonely and dangerous one. The next morning she washed her face, braided her hair, and walked into town. Her head held high. She ignored the scornful glares and the vicious whispers that followed her like a cloud of flies. She walked directly to the sheriff's office and demanded to see Silas. Peters refused. She then tried to speak with him about the case, to plead Silas's innocence. But the sheriff was a weak man, terrified of Bartlett's power, and he refused to listen, hiding behind the damning evidence of the planted gold. Ilara knew then that the law in Redemption Creek was a sham. If she wanted justice, she would have to find it herself. She began her own methodical investigation. She became an observer, a ghost moving through the town that despised her. She spent hours in the general store, pretending to shop for supplies, but in reality, listening to the gossip, to the way the story of the theft was being told and retold, each telling cementing Silas's guilt more firmly in the public mind. She pieced together timelines. She watched the people of the town, their interactions, their fears. She remembered every detail Silas had ever told her about the land and the people who lived on it. Her suspicion quickly fell upon one man, Cobb, Bartlett's sycophantic ranch hand, the man who had so conveniently discovered the gold. She knew from overheard whispers in the saloon that Cobb was a heavy gambler, a man perpetually in debt. He was devoted to Bartlett, the kind of man who would do anything for a few coins and a scrap of approval from a powerful man. She began to watch him. For 3 days, she shadowed Cobb's movements from a distance, learning his routines. He was a creature of habit, spending his master's money at the saloon every night. On the 3rd night, her patience was rewarded. She watched as Cobb, drunk and agitated, left the saloon long after midnight. But instead of heading back to Bartlett's ranch, he stumbled down a dark alley and took a secluded path leading out of town towards a thicket of trees by the creek. Her heart pounding, Ilara followed him, using the silence and stealth Silas had taught her to move through the shadows. She found a hiding place behind a cluster of large rocks and watched as Cobb paced nervously. A few minutes later, another figure emerged from the darkness, Jacob Bartlett, hidden in the darkness. She overheard their conversation, the words carried on the cold night air. "Is that all of it?" Cobb whined, his voice thick with drink and greed. "It ain't enough, not for the risk I took." "You took no risk." Bartlett's voice was a low, contemptuous snarl. "You did as you were told, and this is what we agreed upon. Take it and be grateful." "But if he hangs," Cobb began. "He will hang." Bartlett cut him off, his voice flat and cold as a tombstone. "And you will keep your mouth shut, or I promise you, you will be the next man to swing from a rope in this town. Do you understand me?" The conversation confirmed everything. It was the truth, delivered in the conspirators' own voices. Ilara's heart hammered in her chest. She had what she needed. As she tried to slip away, her foot snagged on a loose root. A small rock skittered across the ground, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. "What was that?" Cobb hissed, spinning around. His eyes, accustomed to the dark, caught the flicker of her movement as she tried to scramble back into the deeper shadows. "Hey, someone's there!" A terrifying chase through the dark woods ensued. Cobb, large and clumsy but spurred by panic, crashed through the underbrush after her. Ilara ran, her lungs burning, her mind racing. She did not run blindly. She used the knowledge of the terrain Silas had given her, the map of this small wilderness he had etched into her mind. She dodged through familiar groves of trees, scrambled up a rocky embankment she knew would be difficult for her pursuer, and waded through the icy creek to cover her trail. She finally managed to lose him, collapsing behind a thicket of willows, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. She had escaped, but she knew, with a chilling certainty, that he had seen her. Perhaps not her face, but he had seen a witness. She now held the dangerous, explosive truth, and Bartlett and Cobb knew that someone was out there who held it. Her life was in imminent danger, but as she huddled in the darkness, a fierce, cold resolve settled over her. She also held the key to Silas's freedom, and she would die before she let it go. The cold did not bite at Alara's skin. It was a deeper chill, one that had settled in her bones and seemed to emanate from the marrow outward. Every rustle of leaves in the darkness, every snap of a twig under some unseen creature's foot sent a jolt of pure terror through her. She was a ghost in the woods she once thought of as a sanctuary. The knowledge she carried was a physical weight, a branding iron on her soul. Bartlett, Cobb. The words were a venomous litany in her mind. To return to the cabin was a death sentence. They would be there. She knew it with a certainty that defied reason. They would be waiting in the shadows of the home Silas had built, a place now tainted by their treachery. She was no longer just a woman in a town that did not want her. She was the hunted, the last loose thread in a carefully woven lie that was about to be pulled tight around her husband's neck. Panic was a wild animal clawing at the inside of her chest, but she beat it back with a raw, desperate will to survive. There was only one place, one person, who had shown her anything other than suspicion or contempt. It was a long shot, a gamble with the highest of stakes, but it was the only card she had left to play. Martha, the homesteader with eyes that had seen too much hardship and a face carved from the unyielding prairie itself. Alara moved through the trees, a phantom guided by a sliver of moon, her path taking her not toward the twinkling lights of Redemption Creek, but away, toward the lonely flicker of a lamp in a distant window. When she reached the small, sturdy cabin, she did not bang on the door. She waited, her breath pluming in the frigid air, until she saw Martha's silhouette pass by the window. Only then did she step onto the porch and knock, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. The door opened a crack, revealing Martha's weary face and the cold, dark barrel of a rifle. "What do you want?" Martha's voice was low, devoid of warmth. "Please," Alara whispered, her own voice cracking. "I need help. I have nowhere else to go." "This ain't a charity house. The town has a sheriff for trouble." Martha's gaze was hard, her grip on the rifle unyielding. Alara knew then that pleading for pity would be useless. This woman was forged in self-reliance, not sympathy. She had to appeal to something stronger, something buried deeper. "This isn't about trouble. Martha, this is about justice. It's about my husband, Silas. He's innocent." Martha's expression did not soften. "That's what they all say." "He was framed," Alara pressed, stepping closer, ignoring the rifle now aimed at her heart. "By Jed Bartlett. I heard him and his man, Cobb, planning it. They planted the gold. They lied to everyone." She poured out the story, the words tumbling over each other in a torrent of truth. She spoke of the late-night meeting, of Bartlett's cruel laughter, of Cobb's bragging. She relayed every damning detail, her voice gaining strength and conviction with each sentence. She was not begging for a handout. She was delivering a testament. Martha listened, her eyes narrowing, searching Alara's face for any sign of deceit. The homesteader had lived in Redemption Creek long enough to know the rot that festered beneath its pious surface. She had no love for Jed Bartlett, a man who wielded his power like a club, who looked at homesteaders like her as little more than dirt to be swept aside for his own ambitions. Still, to cross him was to invite ruin. To help this woman was to risk everything she had scraped and bled for. "You're asking me to stand against Bartlett," Martha said, the words heavy with consequence. "You know what he'll do to me? To my boy?" "I am not asking you to stand against him," Alara said, her eyes locking with Martha's. "I am asking you to stand for what is right. You saw Silas. You spoke with him. You know he is not a thief. He is a good man, a decent man who has been wronged. All I need is a place to stay until morning. One night. To think. To figure out how to save him." The silence stretched between them, thick with the unspoken fears that governed life on the frontier. Martha's gaze flickered past Alara, into the oppressive darkness of the woods, and then back to the younger woman's face. She saw not a frightened girl, but a woman with a spine of steel, a fierce resolve that mirrored her own buried sense of right and wrong. She remembered Silas's quiet dignity, the way he had helped her mend a broken fence post without being asked, the gentleness in his eyes when he spoke of his wife. He was not the monster the town had made him out to be. Slowly, reluctantly, Martha lowered the rifle and stepped back from the door. "One night," she said, her voice a low growl of assent. "But come morning, you're on your own." While Alara found a precarious and temporary safety, Silas sat on the cold stone floor of the town's only jail cell. The air was stale with the ghosts of past miseries, thick with the smell of dust and despair. The so-called trial was scheduled for the next day, but Silas knew it was a farce. It would be a public spectacle, a piece of theater designed to legitimize a hanging. His own fate was a distant concern, a dull ache compared to the sharp, searing pain of his thoughts for Alara. He imagined her alone, unprotected. With him gone, she would be utterly vulnerable. The wolves of this town, men like Bartlett and Cobb, would circle her, and there would be no one to stand in their way. This helplessness was a poison. It was a more profound torture than any physical chains or iron bars. It coursed through his veins, a fever of rage and fear. He could not protect her. The thought was a relentless hammer blow against his soul. He looked at the thick stone walls of his cell, at the small barred window set high above his reach. He would not die in this cage while she was out there alone. Driven by a singular, primal need to get back to her, he began to work on the wall. He used the edge of his metal belt buckle, scraping at the mortar between the stones. The progress was agonizingly slow, the sound a faint, desperate scratching against the oppressive silence. When the buckle bent and became useless, he used his own hands. He pulled and clawed at the crumbling mortar, his fingertips splitting open, his nails tearing, blood mixed with the dust and grime. But he felt no pain. There was only the image of Alara's face, her beautiful, worried eyes, and the burning, all-consuming conviction that he had to get back to her. He worked through the night, his hands raw and bleeding, a man fighting against a mountain of stone, fueled by a love that refused to be extinguished. Alara knew she could not simply walk into the trial and point a finger. It would be her word, the word of an outsider and a woman, against that of the most powerful man in town. They would call her a liar, a madwoman, a spurned lover. They would tear her apart. She needed more. She needed something to shatter the foundation of Bartlett's authority, something to force the truth into the light. She needed irrefutable proof, or she needed to break the conscience of a man who was party to the lie. Her mind seized on the one man in town whose power was not built on land or money, but on the fear of eternal judgment, Reverend Gideon. He was a man who draped himself in righteousness, whose voice boomed with condemnations of sin from the pulpit every Sunday. But Alara had seen the fear in his eyes, the way he deferred to Bartlett, the slight tremor in his hands. He was a weak man, swayed by public perception and terrified of divine retribution. His fear was the crack in the wall she needed to exploit. Before the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky, she slipped away from Martha's cabin and made her way into the silent town. The church was unlocked, a house of God open to any soul seeking solace. But Alara was not seeking solace. She was seeking a weapon. She crept inside, the cavernous space dark and cold. She hid herself in the deep shadows near the altar and waited. An hour later, Reverend Gideon entered, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that had little to do with the early hour. He knelt before the cross, his lips moving in a silent, troubled prayer. This was her moment. Alara stepped out from the shadows. "Reverend," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it echoed in the hallowed silence, sharp and clear as breaking glass. Gideon sprang to his feet with a strangled cry, his hand flying to his chest. "Who's there?" he stammered, peering into the gloom. "A woman whose husband you are about to send to the gallows," Ilara said, moving into the pale light filtering through the stained glass window. His face went ashen. I do not know what you mean. The trial has not yet been held. We both know what the verdict will be, Ilara said, her tone devoid of accusation, filled instead with a solemn, sorrowful weight. She did not approach him with anger. She approached him as a confessor, a spirit of truth in his own sanctuary. I am not here to threaten you, Reverend. I am here to talk about your soul. My soul, he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. You speak of justice every week from that pulpit, she said, gesturing toward the ornate lectern. You warn your flock of the fires of damnation that await those who bear false witness. But what of the shepherd who leads his flock astray? What of the man of God who stands by and allows an innocent man to be murdered to satisfy the greed of another? She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep, resonant terror. She took another step closer. I was in the woods, Reverend. I heard everything. I heard Jed Bartlett and his man plotting to frame my husband. I heard them speak of the planted gold. I know the truth. She let the words hang in the air, a silent indictment. And if I know it, then God knows it, too. He was there in the woods with me. He is here in this church with us now, and he is watching you. Her words were not those of a desperate wife, but of a prophetess delivering a divine warning. She spoke of the indelible stain of a lie, of the eternal weight of a life taken unjustly. She painted a vivid picture of the final judgment, of him standing before his Maker, forced to account for his silence. Gideon began to tremble, sweat beading on his pale forehead. He was a man caught in a vice. On one side was Jed Bartlett, a man who could ruin him in the mortal world. On the other was Ilara, a woman who spoke with the terrifying conviction of one who had seen into the abyss and was now holding him over its edge. His fear of Bartlett was immediate and tangible, but his fear of damnation, a fear that had been drilled into him since childhood, was eternal. He looked at the cross, then at Ilara's unwavering gaze, and his carefully constructed piety began to crumble. He pressured me, Gideon stammered, his voice a pathetic whimper. Bartlett, he said it was for the good of the town, to make an example. An example of what? Reverend? Ilara pressed, her voice softening slightly. That a lie is stronger than the truth? That power is more important than justice? That is not God's law. You still have a chance to save your soul, to save an innocent man. All you have to do is speak the truth. He stared at her, his face a mask of agonizing conflict. He did not agree. He did not refuse. He simply stood there, a broken, terrified man, shaking in the house of his God as the sun began to rise on the day of the trial. The saloon was packed. It smelled of stale beer, sweat, and a tense, bloodthirsty anticipation. Every man and woman who could leave their work had crammed inside, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim self-righteousness. Jed Bartlett sat at a large table at the front, a gavel in his hand, a smug, proprietary air about him. He was not a judge, he was a king holding court. Sheriff Brody stood near the door, his expression uneasy, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Silas was marched in, his hands bound in front of him. He walked tall, his head held high, his eyes scanning the crowd with a look of cold defiance. His gaze swept the room, searching for one face, and a pang of dread and relief hit him when he did not see Ilara. He did not want her to witness this sham. He was led to a chair facing Bartlett, the accused before his accuser. The proceedings were a blur of formalities, a mockery of justice. Bartlett called forth witnesses who mumbled half-truths and rumors, their eyes flicking nervously toward him for approval. The narrative was simple and damning. Silas was a desperate man, an outsider, a thief who had betrayed the town's trust. The planted gold was presented as irrefutable evidence. It was all going according to plan. Bartlett was about to call for a verdict, his lips already curling into a triumphant smile. At that exact moment, the saloon doors swung open with a resounding crash. All heads turned. Framed in the bright morning light stood Ilara. She was not dressed in mourning. nor did she look like a frightened victim. She stood straight and tall, her eyes blazing with a fire that seemed to suck all the air from the room. And behind her, pale and trembling like a leaf in a storm, was Reverend Gideon. A wave of murmurs and gasps rippled through the crowd. Bartlett's smile vanished, replaced by a dark scowl. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" he boomed, trying to reclaim control. "This is a legal proceeding." Ilara strode forward, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. She did not stop until she was standing directly before Bartlett's table. She ignored the gavel he raised, ignored the sheriff moving toward her. She pointed a single, steady finger at the most powerful man in town. "This is not a legal proceeding," she declared, her voice ringing out with absolute clarity, silencing the crowd. "This is a lie, and you, Jed Bartlett, are the liar." Bartlett let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of pure derision. "Well, now we have some entertainment. The desperate wife, come to spin a fanciful tale. Tell us, girl, has your grief made you mad? Or were you spurned by your husband's accomplice and now seek revenge?" He winked at the crowd, playing to their prejudices. "I am not mad, and I am not a liar," Ilara said, her gaze unblinking. "My husband is an innocent man, and you framed him for a crime you orchestrated." "Prove it," Bartlett sneered. "I will," Ilara said, turning her head slightly. Her stare fell upon Reverend Gideon, who flinched as if struck. The preacher's moment of reckoning had arrived. He looked from Bartlett's murderous glare to Ilara's insistent, commanding eyes, with a visible effort that seemed to cost him everything. He took a shuffling step forward. I cannot say what happened," Gideon began, his voice barely a whisper. The crowd leaned in to hear. "But I can say that Mr. Bartlett's influence in this matter has been substantial. He spoke to me of the need for a swift conclusion, for a strong message. My conscience has been troubled." It was not a full confession, not even a direct accusation, but it was enough. It was a crack in the dam. The townspeople, who had been a unified mob moments before, now exchanged uncertain glances. They were wary of being played for fools. Bartlett's face contorted with rage, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "She's telling the truth." All eyes turned to see Martha, standing near the back, her arms crossed over her chest. She had followed Ilara into town, unable to sit by and let injustice be done. At least about one thing: Bartlett's man, Cobb. He claimed Ilara was hiding in the woods near the old mill, eavesdropping, said that's how she knew about the gold. Well, that's a lie, because on that night, she was with me, at my homestead, clear on the other side of the valley. She couldn't have been in two places at once. The murmur in the crowd grew louder, an alibi, a credible one, from a woman they all knew to be honest and plain-spoken. Bartlett's story was starting to unravel. Ilara seized the momentum. "And there is more," she announced, her voice cutting through the noise. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, dark object. She held it up for all to see. It was a button, made of polished antler, distinctive and unusual. "During my husband's arrest, Mr. Cobb chased me into the woods. He grabbed me, and in the struggle, I tore this from his coat." She looked directly at Cobb, who was standing near Bartlett, his face suddenly slick with sweat. "I believe if you examine Mr. Cobb's coat, you will find he is missing a rather unique button." All eyes swung to Cobb. The man instinctively glanced down at his coat, a gesture of pure, unthinking guilt. In that moment, everyone saw it, the frayed thread on his lapel where a button was conspicuously absent. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was potent. It placed Cobb with Ilara, in a struggle he had denied. It made him a liar. The man began to panic. He looked at Bartlett, seeking guidance, an escape, but all he saw in Bartlett's eyes was cold, calculating fury. Cobb realized with a sickening certainty that he was being sized up as a scapegoat. Bartlett would sacrifice him to save himself. That realization broke him. "He made me do it!" Cobb screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Bartlett. It was all him. He said we needed to get rid of Silas, that he was in the way. He gave me the gold, told me where to hide it in the cabin. It was all his idea." The confession landed like a thunderclap. The saloon erupted into absolute chaos. Men shouted, women screamed, and the entire room surged forward. Justice, it turned out, was not as simple as they had been led to believe. In the pandemonium, Bartlett saw his world collapsing. His power, his control, all of it was vanishing in an instant. With the snarl of a cornered animal, he pulled a pistol from beneath his coat. He lunged for Alara, intending to take her hostage, to use her as a shield to escape the mess of his own making. But he had forgotten about Silas. Through the entire proceeding, Silas had been watching, waiting, his muscles coiled like a spring. The moment the chaos erupted and the sheriff's attention was diverted, he snapped the cheap ropes binding his wrists with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength. He saw Bartlett move toward Alara, and the world narrowed to that single existential threat. He launched himself forward, covering the distance between them in 2 powerful strides. He did not reach for a gun. He did not need one. His final confrontation with Bartlett was swift, brutal, and deeply personal. He slammed into the man, his shoulder driving into Bartlett's chest, sending the pistol flying across the room. He grabbed the man who had tried to destroy his life, to steal his wife, and delivered a justice that was far more primal than anything the law could offer. It was the justice of a man defending his family, delivered with the raw, physical strength of a man who had been pushed past his breaking point. Bartlett crumpled to the floor, subdued and broken. His reign of terror over Redemption Creek finished. In the days that followed, a quiet, shamefaced pall settled over the town. Silas was freed, the charges against him dissolving into embarrassed apologies and averted gazes. There were no grand pronouncements of regret, no public atonements, but a few of the townspeople, Martha among them, approached Silas and Alara with quiet offers of help, of supplies, of money. It was a silent admission of their complicity, a restitution for a sin they could not bring themselves to name. Silas and Alara accepted it, not as charity, but as their due. But they both knew this place could never be their home. Their names would forever be linked to the scandal, the violence, the day Redemption Creek was forced to look at the ugliness in its own heart. They had not saved the town from its prejudices, but they had, against all odds, saved each other. A few days later, they were ready to leave. Their few belongings were packed onto Silas's sturdy horse and a mule purchased with the town's guilt money. They rode out not at dawn, but in the full light of day, their heads held high. They were not slinking away in shame. They were leaving on their own terms. They headed west, towards the vast, open territories, towards a future that was unwritten, a blank page waiting for their story. As they crested the last rise that overlooked the town, Alara turned in her saddle. She looked at the small collection of buildings, a place that had almost been their end, and felt nothing. She turned back to face the endless expanse of the plains stretching out before them. The wind picked up, catching her long dark hair, the beautiful hair she had once been willing to sacrifice, and sent it flying out behind her like a banner of freedom. It was unbound, untamed, and utterly hers. Silas reached over from his horse, his hand finding hers, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. Their future was as uncertain and wild as the land ahead, but they would face it together, their love a quiet, resilient force, a testament to the enduring hope that can be forged and tempered in the very darkest of fires. Thank you for listening to our story. Please feel free to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans, and do not forget to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts.